T21 Alchemy. Yeah. T21 Alchemy. It's a T21 Alchemy. T21 Alchemy. It's a T21 Alchemy. Welcome to the T21 Alchemy Podcast. I'm your host, Oneness Sankara. This podcast was birthed out of my lived experience as a mother to a phenomenal little boy with T21, aka Down syndrome, and the creative journey of turning this life into a play. In this episode, we're going to zoom into something very important to many SEND parents, and especially to parents of children with T21 Down syndrome, speech and language. Now, in this area, I only have my lived experience, so I thought that I would call in an expert, a speech and language therapist, one that my son and I have worked with for years through the Lejeune Clinic, Cathy Johnston. Welcome, Kathy. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you so much.
What do you do and who do you mainly work with?
Thank you so much, Oneness, for the opportunity to come and chat with you and whoever else is in the audience today, that hopefully we can grapple with some of the questions and queries and worries and thoughts that people have around communication and speech language. So yeah, I'm Cathy Johnston. I am a speech and language therapist, have been working for a really long time, over 20 years as a speech language therapist. And my area of interest, or the sort of people I work with specifically, are children, young children under 5 typically, and their families. So I think, I see my role is very much sort of the beginning of a journey for families with communication needs, usually at the beginning of a journey that might be quite long. So I think, and working with a team of speech language therapists, so I work with the Lejeune Clinic, and that's how I've got to know you and Pedamac. And then I also work in an NHS trust. So I've my sort of starting place, I guess. I'm from Australia, and I grew up in an outback in a very rural and remote part of Australia where access was a challenge for health. And that was one of the main sort of things that made me want to work to support that and to support communication, regardless of where you are. I think that was always, and so telehealth was something I grew up with, interestingly, many years ago because of where I grew up. And so being able to, help communication happen, regardless of where you are and sort of where you begin your journey, was the main motivator for me to become a speech language therapist. So that's for now where I am, is working with the pediatric population of under 5, basically.
Okay, lovely. And what part of your work gives you the most energy, and which part of your work tests you most?
I feel very privileged to work with families so closely, and that I'm still doing this job 20 years later, I think, is testimony to the opportunities and rewards that it brings. I love working with children and their families, and the energy, that's where I get the energy. I think either working with them or with other colleagues and supporting allies, as you've described, I think, in some of your comms, supporting allies as well as the children and young people themselves to understand what we can all be doing to support communication, whether it's my colleagues who are maybe newer to the profession of speech language therapists, whether it's education colleagues or health colleagues, to sort of understand what is the role of speech language therapy within the context of a human's growth through life, and what can we do to support that. So I think the best bits of my job are getting to work with people like yourself, getting to empower parents to really feel like they have an understanding of what's going on for them and their child, and to feel like they can be in charge of that, and to use the support that's out there, but to be the ones that are the experts for them and their children. And I think that's the bit where I get the most rewards. The most challenging parts are probably the things that, if you ask anyone who works in public health sector, education is just big caseloads, lots of need, and sort of the stretch that brings, and supporting my team of speech and language therapists to be able to do that well and to manage that and manage their own stress, I guess, in doing that. So I think that's the more challenging part of it, for sure.
And when you meet a family with a child who has Down syndrome or STEM's needs, what's usually on their mind around communication?
Okay, such a good question. I think it depends on where in the journey that parent or young person is. So either the child themselves or the parent as well. I think if we're thinking specifically around families with a child with Down syndrome, in the Lejeune Clinic, we do a lot of work to support, in the virtual context, to support families who live in lots of different places. So they may or may not have the type of health support that I would do in the NHS. They may be in completely different parts of the world. They may have different services available to them. So that means that what we're doing is literally coming right back to them and their child and looking at what is happening with you in your space. What's going on for you? What's making you worried? What's making you, I try and always ask parents what's bringing you joy, to help bring it back to looking at the things that are already going well for families, because I think there's as a parent of a child with Down syndrome or SEN more generically, there's often I get a sense it's so overwhelming. There's so much information. There's so many different people to keep a track of. I think being a parent's quite overwhelming anyway. Keeping a track of all the jobs you have to do as a parent, as well as whatever you're doing already as your sort of chosen life path or career. And then managing the medical needs, the health needs, the developmental needs of your child with SEN or with Down syndrome, it can feel completely overwhelming. So I think when I meet family and they go, oh, speech language therapist, my child's got Down syndrome, I want to know what I can do to make their speech better. I want to know what I can do, how do they compare to other children? How do they compare to other children with Down syndrome? And what do you think they'll be like? How do you think it will progress? And I think for me, that is that sort of anxiety. And am I doing enough as a parent? Do you think I'm doing enough? I need to do more, or they should be doing more to support their communication. So I feel like there's a real deficit focus in terms of how that may be shared, and also when they sort of in a bigger picture view of speech language therapy, or what that means and why it needs to be supported. I think there's perhaps a view that we're going to wave a wand and it will be really better. And that isn't what I can offer either. So I think there's a bit of a tension around, I can offer you lots of support. I'm on this journey with you, but it is your journey. And it's going to be something you're going to need me and other people on the way, and you're doing a great job. I think that's where it is. It's about sort of knowing where is this parent on that journey of learning what their child's needs are, learning what they can manage in their family situation, and sort of understanding what communication difficulty looks like for their child. And maybe it's not that difficult. Maybe they're doing brilliant things, but they have this idea that it's going to be bad. So I think that's sort of trying to help move that deficit model into sort of looking at the things that are going well. What joyful moments are you having with your child, and what skills do they already show you, and helping parents tune into that is sort of where I'm starting, hopefully, that journey as well.
Yeah. And as you say that, like, definitely as a parent myself, you're like, am I doing enough?
Absolutely.
Because you want to give your child the best possible chance. Yeah. And, we generally put a lot of pressure on ourselves, I think, as parents.
Absolutely.
Anyway. And then when, your child does have different needs, then that kind of, it feels like it's tenfold.
Absolutely. I think also, we meet families where they perhaps had a diagnosis and that's a complete shock, and there's a lot of information, and they've just had a baby and now they've got a baby with additional needs, and they're just going, well, you're doing a brilliant job. You're a mom or a dad. This is the first and foremost, is that congratulations, you have a new baby, and isn't that amazing? and someone's told you there's all these things that may or may not happen to them. There may be lots of diagnoses happening. So communication, I think at that point, depends if you're that early phase of just being like, I'm prepared, and that's all you should be thinking about. So it's then just going, that's enough, celebrate that. And then when you're ready, we can start that journey a bit more. But I think that sort of sense that there's a lot I need to know. What do I need to know? What are going to be the problems? And anticipating future, I think, is a lot of the constantly anticipating what's ahead, trying to work out the best way of navigating and shoring up your boat, ready for that storm. And I think that's quite tiring. So I'm trying to, right now, let's just be where we are now. And let's look at what we can do now.
The being in the moment. You mentioned the word communication, right? And I'm going to say a bit of a kind of false binary of like speech versus communication. Like, what's the difference and why is that?
I love your lead in. Because it's not like, it isn't just, and I think part of the challenge around speech language therapy is the fact that or speech therapy, which has been what we've been called, as clinicians, or the sort of that approach, is that it's just about speech. And one of my biggest sort of lifelong challenges professionally is to try and help the world understand that communication is like the umbrella. Communication is the key bit to being a human, and the key bit that's important. And it's big. It's a big thing. There's a whole systems that we can be considering when we think about communication, and speech is one bit of that. But I think this is the bit that gets the focus, because it's the bit that people hear or people can understand for themselves. So shall I go into that? The communication bit. So I think of communication is, if you think about how we as an individual human can communicate our messages with the world and use our body to do that. So we may use nonverbal language, i.e. the way we posture our bodies, how we sit, whether we use sort of, a different posture and stance, how we use our face, how we use our voice, if we're using voice, but even just sort of eye movement, eye gaze. We talk about that non-verbal eye gaze. So, for example, I'm kind of holding my cup of tea, but if I look at you and then look at my tea and look at you, look at my tea, I can start to give you a message without words. I really just need to have a sip of tea. Those ways that we're communicating, we're taking my thought pattern and I'm giving it to you, and you're able to interpret it and understand it. So the communication is sort of getting the messages from the world, decoding them, understanding them, putting them together, and then giving back a message to the world. And I think so then language and speech fit within that. So communication is how we're using our language systems that are like the code of a computer that our brain has of understanding and making sense of the world. So we have sort of this input. Is that quite nice sort of image of it coming, things coming in, and then our brain is the computer processing, making sense of it, all that information that we get from our senses. Decoding, like if you think of coding, I think all of us are much more tuned into this idea of coding now that we're such a digital community. But if you think of our bodies have been doing this forever. They're basically taking information that we see, smell, taste, hear, or feel viscerally in our own bodies, and make sense of it, decode it, and then decide whether we're going to do something with that to share in communication and share it back with someone else. And then the way we use our body to do that is that language system, or that communication, or that expressive language system. And speech is one of the ways that we typically do that. In typical communication development, speech is what's seen as the thing humans can do to do that. But we have lots of other skills and strengths on the journey to getting to that place. And I think that's the sort of differentiation for parents, to help understand that speech might feel, and I think I then will be trying to speech might not be where we're going just yet, but we need to look at the whole system for your child and all the bits that have to happen before you get to the place where you're going to hear your child use speech sounds or use words that you can recognize. And it's so different for each child as well. So it doesn't always go at the same pace, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so you've answered some of this already, but like, why is it that speech does carry such emotional weight?
So another really good question. Speech, I think, we see that as one of the differences for us as humans, this incredible capacity for us to sequence sounds. So speech is itself the use of our articulation system. There's lots going on when we talk about speech, if you like. So I've already touched on there's language in speech language therapy talk. I'm using jargon, so I hopefully define it as I go, because I know that can be part of the confusion of engaging with us. So language is this idea that we understand what's going in our brains, what our receptive language is. We see things around us. We understand words or meanings of things in our language system. And then we decide we have a reason that we might want to share back with our world. And so we're developing that language system, the coding, the rules and structures that different languages have to convey messages to people. For example, knowing what the words are, knowing the names of things, being able to choose the right words, having an image of what they are, and being able to sort of store them in categories. We often talk about like categories of language. And when it comes to speech, we are using part of that structure and language to be able to sequence sounds, to put the sound in the right order. But speech is essentially how we use sounds to make up the words that are in our coding system. So we use our articulators, the teeth, the tongue, the jaw, the cheeks, the muscles in the cheeks, and the voice box. So very facial expression as a side effect of being speech language therapist. But things like being able to turn voice on, so you can feel your voice box vibrate when you go ah, or if you say a voiced sound in English. So p is a voiceless sound. There's no voice on, whereas b is a voiced sound. So you can hear b. We have our lips together. We have air coming out quickly. It's a plosive sound. No voice, p, voice, b. So we're having to coordinate all of those muscles, all of those articulators to make the right sounds. And then we're using our language structures or our coding system to put them in the right order to make words, i.e. k, a, t. Together, when we put those sequence of sounds in the order, they make cat. So in terms of what speech is, you might have the word cat represented in your head. You might look and see a cat and understand. You might have a sign for cat, which is that nice chunking of the language and the meaning. But the speech sound is taking that to a different coding level, where you're having to hear the sounds, understand the sequence they go in, and say them. So that's essentially where speech is different. And I think the reason it's emotive is because that is how we understand. It's an efficient way of communicating. It's much more efficient to use that system to communicate. It's very much linked to what society has deemed the right way to communicate. So I think we have that, there's a sort of, I think thinking about that sort of prejudice perhaps about how speech, if you have difficulties with speech or sequencing sounds, then you might have difficulties understanding, which may or may not be the case, because your language system could be perfectly fine, but the muscles that are coordinating those speech sounds are not as strong or coordinated, which is something we often see in children with Down syndrome or with people who have Down syndrome in their speech. So
yeah. Well, there's a lot that you've said in there that's really, like, one of the things is like,
you order a podcast. Have you subscribed? It helps the podcast.
When things like when our speech develops at a typical rate, we don't think.
You don't think about it.
You don't think how complex, it's
incredible.
We're extraordinary. And then there's this whole complex thing
There's
taking,
so many layers of coding happening. Absolutely.
and then you mentioned something which, like, we are in a sort of like word-centric, speech biased kind
Yes.
of society, you know?
Yes.
And I wonder if part of that is cultural, because not saying that other languages don't speak and use words, etc., in other cultures, but it's like, you know, like the written word of the law, you know.
Yes.
And when we're talking about communication, you can step into a room and feel that the vibe is off, or how somebody looked at
That's all
you.
the non-verbal information.
Non-verbal
Yeah,
information.
absolutely.
But like legally, it would be like, yes, but did they say that?
Yes, absolutely. I guess, your point. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
think that we have like.
So it's our evidence, essentially, of what our communication is in that way.
And then in turn, on another level, we read the people's verbal communication level as evidence of their like understanding, their comprehension, and where it's not necessary that these things correlate, but it's kind of like what we built up as a culture.
Yeah, I think there's lots of different layers of what you described there, and I think interestingly, if you look at how our brain, I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, I am a clinician. But I think just thinking about how in my clinical experience, using things like, we know that rhythm, music, and vocalizing with, not necessarily with speech, not necessarily with words, but sometimes just through voice. When I say voice, I'm just literally just vocalizing, using our voice to communicate messages as well. And in different cultures and communication systems, that may or may not have more weight. So I think you're right. It's just about wherever a family or a child's growing up, they're going to be layering in the context of their environment. And that's so much of what we need to consider whenever we're looking therapeutically or supporting a family as well. It's like, what's function for you? What's your normal? What's the layers of understanding in your family, in your context? Because that is your child's world. That is the language that they're growing up with. And so I guess looking at speech, it's still a motivating thing that most parents and families would like their child to have. And that's, I think, because we know that's, as parents, often that's how you communicate. So it feels like the way you're going to have that connection. And I think that's possibly the emotive part of it. So part of looking and supporting parents on that journey is helping them recognize the different ways we can communicate in addition to or instead of speech, if that's something we need to consider. And it's not necessarily saying ever that speech will be out of reach for you or your child, but it's just saying where your child is now, these are their strengths and these are valid ways that they're using their body to communicate. So we need to acknowledge and celebrate them, help build their language system. So they've got that system of being able to then communicate to the best of that they're able to do. So be the best communicator they can be within the context of their body and their experiences. So I guess that would be the goal that we're looking to achieve.
And you did something really interesting when you were talking about the sound and stuff, where you actually touched, right? When you did the birth, because some people will be looking at this, people just be listening. And so it's actually a really, as our understanding as parents, as allies who may not be having that lived experience with their speech, like to actually, touch your throat and you can feel the vibration.
Feel the difference, exactly.
Just kind of understanding the mechanics of what's going on. And
absolutely.
In relation to, so there's a couple of things. You said so many, like,
I'm sorry. Too many layers.
As in, I want to go back and listen and like, to certain bits. But when you were speaking about the non, like, forgetting about words for a minute, like those things that help. Like, we used to do a lot of beatboxing.
Yes.
So my background's in the arts.
Yes.
So we used to, we have lots of things, tongue twisters, just sound, breathing, all of that kind of stuff.
Breathing, absolutely. Well, breathing is an articulator. Breath and lungs are part of the articulation system. And I think we're so constantly like this, breathing up here, that we forget we've got huge lung capacity and that we can teach children what that feels like. But I think, sorry to interrupt you, but just to say one thing that leaves my brain is this idea that when we have a lived experience, I think doing speech sound work is extremely difficult for someone who has speech sound work to understand how it feels to be someone who finds that difficult, as you've described. So we only have our own bodies within which we feel that sensation and awareness, whereas children with Down syndrome will have their own awareness, their own strength of cheek, buccal strength, cheek strength. Do they have lip seal? Can they keep their saliva in their mouth, which is a way you can see if they have lip seal. So these are things like muscle strength, muscle movement and coordination. Those are, and your point about sort of feeling, what does it feel like to have your vocal folds vibrate, which is essentially what it is when we add voice. You can feel it, and we have lots of sounds in English where we don't use our voice, where we're just using air without vocal fold vibration. So it's like, they're quiet sounds, and they are often harder for children who may have high frequency hearing loss to hear as well. So I think it's not just how it feels to make those sounds, but it's also how children are perceiving those sounds. So your point then about beatboxing or other ways of using your body, that is also a way of helping speech sound coding or decoding, because it helps teach other things like rhythm or syllable structure. Those things have other sort of what we call phonological awareness, which has an impact on speech. And that's how all the sounds that we use are coded, essentially. That we have a syllable structure, that we have a prosody or the musicality of our voices when we speak. And all those things help learn the speech sound, how to use speech to communicate as well. Sorry, now I've interrupted you.
It's all right. I interrupt too. It's excitement,
yes,
neurodiversity, all of it, right?
Yeah.
And one of the other things, because guess where we're going is some of the why specifically for children with Down syndrome.
Why things are harder.
Anatomy of it all, and could you touch on things like size of mouth and things like that?
So all the different reasons that might be difficult.
Okay. Just for our understanding, if that is helpful. I don't know.
Absolutely. Well, I think there's lots of things that can impact on So basically, if you think about what speech is, it's creation of sounds, and it's using our lung, our breath, and where that gets directed and shaped by our articulator. So it's basically a flow of breath coming from our lungs through our airway, past the vocal folds, which are like tiny little vibrating muscles, like beautifully tuned instruments that are vibrating at such high frequency that makes different pitches in terms of high notes or low notes, depending on our voice box anatomy, exactly as you've described, and how long they are. And then it gets shaped by our articulators, which are the muscles and bones and sort of soft tissue in our face, mainly, obviously from airway, but face. So it's like, nasal cavities, the palate, which closes off your nose so you don't have food come out your nose when you swallow. But it's basically also directs air. So you can have nasal sounds where the air comes through the nose, or sounds where air comes through your mouth, and where you're moving the muscles of your face, of your cheeks, of your tongue. We have the tongue has the most muscles, and so your point is anatomy is one part. Yes. So it's actually structure. What are the structures that might help or hinder speech sound clarity? So, sometimes we have what's called palate insufficiency. If you think of palate is the bit at the back of the hard palate is the front behind your teeth, and then the soft palate is the soft little flappy bit at the back of your throat. And some people don't. So, and then we have the back of our throat that's like this, and then the palate lifts and closes. So when we swallow, it lifts to stop, as I said, food coming out our nose, but it also lifts when we're trying to direct a voice through our mouth rather than a nose sound. And some people might actually have what's a shorter palate, basically. And so there's a gap, which means there's always going to be a little bit of air coming through their nose, and that's an anatomical thing. So that's actually, that's a structural part of your body that is difficult to change. There is ways you can look at that, but typically you have to work with that function. So that is what you have. So you're then looking at how are you managing that? How are you keeping your sound as much as you can, the air coming through your mouth? So that's one example. The tongue, for example, tongue and mouth and jaw size, and also the hearing, that sort of the ear, because obviously hearing challenges are a common part of the presentation for children, which will impact speech. For children with Down syndrome, a glue ear, they have a very tiny middle ear which gets full of gunk, and that means that they hear sounds differently. It's like hearing it through the air waves, not moving as in the same way, so that the sound is different by the time it gets picked up by the auditory nerve and decoded. So in those cases, then you might have, your child might have a tongue, for example, that's too big for their mouth at that point, or they might have a tongue that's not very able to coordinate, or it's quite low tone. So typically, I guess when families are sort of learning about what is their child's presentation with Down syndrome, there's a group of children who will have more difficulty with organizing and moving and motor coordination, what we call oromotor skills. Okay, and that is so one of the things is muscle strength and muscle, the actual strength. Like if you go to the gym and you can work on muscles, but those muscles, they might have a sort of nerve capacity challenge that is always going to be a bit weaker. There might be something that means that those muscles are always going to be a little bit weaker, what we call hypotonic. And then for children where we're looking at oromotor stuff, that's about how we're coordinating the movements. How I said your brain's coding and decoding. So for each little bit of code, it's sending, so my okay, so I need to send the back of my tongue to the top of my palate to do the sound. There's no voice on, it's voice off. And then I need to do ah. So it's a different shape again for that. Ah, it's just flow of air to make the vowel with spread mouth. And then again, no voice on, just a little plosive sound of air, but the teeth are together, and it's a quick sound. So, but your brain has to work out that really fast. It's just mind-blowing.
It's like slowing down the moment and realizing.
Yeah, and you're like, all the work involved, I think. And when you consider that, you're like, it's amazing. And all the work that your children are doing when they're learning how to do that for a child is when we're looking at the visual support and information they can get, how they're hearing it, and then for them, what it feels like. And what it feels like when they're all going, yeah, because they're like, okay, that seems to get the response that I'm looking for. How do I get back to that sound again? How do I coordinate those sounds again? So those are all the ways that we're sort of coordinating.
As you said that, I'm thinking back. And I'm thinking back in my son's journey.
Yeah.
And like I remember there would be a time where he would say something and then not say it again for ages.
Yeah.
Like I remember he said his brother's name and then he didn't say it for about a year. And
it feels frustrating.
And it is frustrating, and it was frustrating for his brother, right? But now when I think about it, I'm like, he said it and then he had to almost like figure out
how to get back there.
Everybody went, oh yeah, he said his name. And then it was like, oh yeah, that's great. I don't know. Like how do I go back and do that again?
So I think that's where we do lots of prompting, a sort of not prompting, but like helping by modeling, lots of cueing and modeling. So I think we get excited like, yeah, do it again. But what we can do each time is just keep modeling, because each time we're modeling, we're helping build that pathway of how I got to that place, how I got that sequence correct for that word. And I think coming back to sort of the speech part, it's not just the articulation of speech in terms of where we see difficulty. So for children with Down syndrome, there are groups that we know that speech articulation and strength is a challenge, the coordination of it, and then perhaps the strength in it depending on tone for individual children. And then the other part of it is the coding part. So that's the knowledge that there's a sound here. If I'm going to say the word for this, for this creature, cat, that I need a sound at the beginning, I need a sound in the middle, and then I need a sound at the end. And that's what we call that sort of phonological coding. So we see sometimes speech errors, which are in them. So I always say to parents, that's great. If you've got a different sound in there, then we can work with that, because it's showing you that you've got, your child may have an understanding tat, for example, instead of cat, then it's not that hard. Basically all that's different from tat and cat is where the tongue is. The tongue just needs to go backwards to make a k. But at the same time, there's a sound at the beginning, there's a sound in the middle, there's a sound at the end. So we can work, there's that coding is there. Does that make sense? So it's sort of like there's the coding part, there's the strength part, and then there's the coordination and the sort of the planning and delivery of it. That's what's going on.
And I think it's like, and it's the sort of balance of having an understanding of these things to a basic level, just so that there's an appreciation.
Yeah. Of the energy and effort.
What your young person is doing, but not worrying about actually having to know all of it in order to help.
Don't worry about having to know it, because that's our job. I guess about knowing what's useful to you on your journey and where you are with it. I think, just if I can, I would always say my main objective with families that I work with, and remembering that my clinical work is under 5, it's before school typically, but sometimes into that early years of school as well. And my main goal here is to really do that early work with families, to help families feel like they have enough of an understanding of what they need to know, and they have enough of an understanding of the different ways that parents can create the best environment for a child to be the best communicator they can be. And sometimes there might be some more focused work needed, for example, speech work. But generally the type of work I'm doing when I work with our families that come through Lejeune is looking at a more whole person approach about what are the things that are really challenging you and your child's communication. What are the things you'd really like to make better for you right now, right where you are right now, and start with where we are now, look at the strengths, and then build on that. So it's not just the speech, it's trying to look at the whole situation,
the whole picture, and then what's right for your family.
That family. Yeah, exactly.
But I want to share with you like, I don't know, like a 30-second piece from my training.
What I'm really saying is that some people think that parents like me are overprotective. And maybe we are overprotective because our children are underprotected. Thus, the results, though sometimes unintended, can mean that we're defensive. Though our defense is tied to our children needing to be defended from expensive consequences, especially when life overloads their senses. So am I sensitive outside of my menses? The answer is yes. Sensitive and terrified. That when I'm not around, he may be denied and have his needs minimized.
That's really powerful. And it's such a privilege for you to share that. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. I guess so the clip touches on why families can be so worried about communication in relation to their child's needs. So can you just reflect on that from your side?
Absolutely. I mean, I would concur. I think in that space, there's two elements that you've depicted so beautifully. One is your own internal, your sort of working through of how to be supportive but not overly supportive. Perhaps you can tell me if I'm interpreting incorrectly, but this idea that I need to be protecting you, but I'm also trying to enable you. And how do I do that? And I think that's such a challenge in parenting anyway. And I think your point is then when it comes to communication, that sense that, well, what we say to parents as clinicians is you're your child's best communication partner. and I think you know that already because you've been interpreting them from birth. So you interpret all their behaviors, you're understanding how they're using their body to share their messages. And sometimes that can be, tricky, even for someone who is as tuned in as a parent. So then that awareness of how difficult that might be for you, who knows them best, means that you're extrapolating into the rest of the world going, well, they haven't got the motivational interest that I do, perhaps, to make sure I understand and interpret my child to the best way I can, which means you feel vulnerable for yourself and for them. And I think that is absolutely the experience that as a clinician I see for families, both in terms of where that fear is and why we're working together, on communication, but also perhaps the reality of that. You may have seen that, your child may have experienced that. Hopefully not, but this is the challenge. And then so much of what we're working on is actually I would say the majority of my educational outward trying to sort of increase awareness is that a young person is always trying to balance their own and need to have co-regulation anyway and support to manage emotion and to have that modeled. And in addition to that, if there's communication needs, they're needing some support to get their message out there, but also perhaps to interpret messages that are coming in. And as the adults in the situation, if it's the parent or perhaps an educator in a childcare setting or in a school, or in a different context for an older person or in a care situation, then they have to be the person who has more, that is using all of their body as well to do the interpreting. And I think that is the message that I see is communication is everyone's business, the whole children's workforce, not just parents. This is about inclusion because every child deserves to have the space to be able to give their best messaging and be able to try and make sense and be regulated in their environment. So much of the work we're doing is looking at environment, whether that environment is home. And that's the bit I guess I like working with. This is why I work with under 6, because I get to work with parents. And then I also get to work with educators in the early years provisions. And I think there is such challenge there. There is a need for support and education. And I think as a workforce, they don't always get that support. And so then it's about educating them and helping them feel and understand and feel empowered as well to support all children to access the environment in the way that can be understood and for them to get their messages across, but then obviously also in the school space as well. It makes me feel sad, proud, and that there's still so much work to do, I guess, would be my reflection.
Yeah. But I think one of the things that you said key is that it's everybody's business.
Communication is everybody's business.
Everybody's business. And it's, I had an experience recently, which was a good experience, where we were invited by another family to their family trip. And it was so inclusive. Not because anybody tried to make it inclusive, because I sent a brief ahead, but just because everybody cared that everybody was having a good time.
Yeah, indeed.
That just meant that everybody took time to
notice.
To notice, to that people's needs were met. Like, do you need something? What? You can come here. It was beautiful. And actually, like, after those experiences, sometimes I'm quite emotional because I'm like, I realize how much it's not the everyday.
Yeah, exactly. The fact that you've noticed it means it's standing out.
you know, but that simple thing, and especially like when we're saying, you know, like speaking to allies and other people around, that just by taking time and caring and being sensitive makes the world of difference for everyone. So so that really stood out to me, it being everybody's. Now I've actually got quite a few more questions, but we're not going to go into all of them because you've said so many amazing things. I remember you saying that I think you said you're not a neuro something at some point.
I'm not a neuroscientist. I quite like reading about neuroscience, but I'm not a neuroscientist.
So maybe or maybe not, you can answer my next question, which is just maybe just a little bit of a geeky question that I wonder about, which is like, does the brain, but less specifically talking about children with Down syndrome, does it like, I don't know, like adapt or
wire
in relation to like communication over time?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's wiring for the first part. In terms of looking at it as a clinician, you think, well, actually, as we learn language, inclusive of children with Down syndrome, they are learning the wiring for that decoding of sensory information. So basically the information that we can, that our senses give us and our brain, they're wiring that pathway of information comes in from the senses, from the skin, from the tongue, from the, from all of our body, as well as internally. So not easy to see that bit. That's the bit, the decoding for parents to work out as you go. But that basically the body's the brain is getting lots of messages, and it's wiring then to then work out what do I make sense of that? What does that mean? And now what do I do? And then it sends the message back out to the muscles that move the body, or to use the body to then give that message that they will have to share with the world. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, the idea of neuroplasticity, there's lots of general research that I would encourage people to go and look at for themselves rather than listening to it from me, because it's not my specialism. But we definitely know that repetition of activities and practice and opportunity to practice is key to helping brain pathways be wired, if you like. Because if you're talking about communication development, that is the first time it's being wired. It's being made and connecting. And I mean, it starts in utero, but it's continuing, and it continues for quite some time. There's lots of changing views about sort of what we call critical windows and how brains keep growing and changing. What we do know that when it comes to language, for example, that language learning then drives cognition and memory. So those things, it's not necessarily, when I say language, I'm talking about language being more than words. So it's what we understand of the word, of vocabulary that stands for the world around us. And that could be something that we're seeing through sign, through pictures, but basically it's meaning that you're taking in, as well as the way you're communicating your message out. So we know that when children start to learn vocabulary, then their cognition also develops, and that the wiring for that. So the brain is constantly moving and organizing in those early phases of life, for sure. And we know that the repetition, so you made that comment about that word, so for your son's brother's name, and then it's about then going, oh, I don't know how I got that, but it's this idea that as the parent, and coming and sort of touching on your previous question around how we support communication and the environment part, is that by creating an environment that enables repetition or practice or opportunity, then you're giving your child's brain, as it wires for communication, the most opportunity to practice as it's gaining those new skills. So it's about knowing that you as a parent are probably naming things, labeling things, signing things, talking about things, and you're not getting a lot back. You're not going to get that speech back perhaps yet, or you're not getting many signs back yet. But it's this idea that is all just being wired, coordinated and organized. And then at some point, the body will have a way of getting it back, of being able to sort of give you back that message. I hope that answers the question a little.
Yeah. Like, yes, like sort of the, it's not delayed gratification, but it's the idea that just like, but it is knowing that, or having faith. I think it's a faith thing, that
having hope and faith that what you're doing is going to work.
Yeah, and that what you're putting in, is going somewhere. Yes. However that ends up being expressed, it ends up being expressed. Yes. But like you're not wasting time, you know, like it's going in. And I guess I asked that question in relation to the neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change. I mean, I'm not, right, this is not my area of expertise at all, but just the idea that the brain can change and form new things through practice.
The T21 Alchemy Podcast is part of a wider creative project exploring disability, inclusion, real, lived experience, hosted by artist and advocate Oneness Sankara, my mom. The series sits alongside a developing play and research-informed work curated in conversation with Sen families and communities.
We get told a lot about early intervention,
of course,
and
does that people feel anxious or worried, I guess, as well?
Because then you start to think, did I start early?
Have I missed the boat?
Did I intervene early, right? And then especially if, you know, like for whatever reasons, it could be family reasons, it could be the child's health or whatever.
Context is everything.
Yeah, that as a family or as parents, you weren't able to start as early. Yeah. Like, you know, are you doomed if you didn't catch the early intervention? Like when is early intervention?
When is early intervention? That's a good question. So I guess early intervention is the bit I feel quite passionate about, but it is so my books, that is under 6. But your point is really important to overshare, if you like, and that is that there is no space for guilt in this working collaboratively with families. And it's knowing that this is where you're at now, and where you've been is helpful to know that that's now where informed the place you're at, and you've got your lived experience and your child has theirs as well on that shared journey. And now you're here and you've met me, and now we're going to look at where you are now. And it's really useful as a clinician to know where you've come from and what's happened, because it helps contextualize for us to know what's been tried and did it have an impact or not, because that's part of us looking at sort of how fast we do things, or how much you need to do things, for example. But I guess coming back to early intervention from my perspective, because there's a lot, you know, I work in services and where that looks different, perhaps because of service design. And the whole point from my perspective of early intervention is to teach the adults in the space rather than the child in the space. Because what we're doing when we talk, from my perspective in working in that way collaboratively with families, is we're setting you up for this journey that's coming. And you don't need me as a speech therapist with you for all of that journey. But it's quite helpful to have someone to help set you up and say, this is where you're at. I can see this is really hard, or I can see this bit's going okay. And it's okay. What you're doing now, let's make it as functional as it can be for you to fit in amongst health, medical, surgery, perhaps if there's that, your own work or capacity, or other family members, or aging parents, all of those things, housing crises, you know, other things that come into play into life that you then have to navigate at the same time as you're hoping to support your child's development. So all of those things, it's about knowing which bits can you control and which bits can you not control. And the bits that you can control are about how you respond in your everyday life with your child. And that's where I'm pitching to start. And for me, that is intervention. And that's what I hope parents get from working with us when we do our parent workshops in Lejeune, is that actually everyday life, everyday routine, everyday conversations. When I say conversations, I'm talking about interactions that are, it might be a smile and a nod with a new baby. That's a conversation. You have a turn, they have a turn. That's the beginning of wiring a brain, your baby's brain, to know that if I do something and mum smiles back at me, that floods the dopamine into my brain, makes me ready to take on, the vocab when it comes to that. But basically it's training you as the parent that I need to take turns and notice all the things my child's doing. And it teaches your child that when they use their body to communicate, they get a response. And that is the start of communication, the start of interaction. And it's from there that you then build on each of the tiny ways your child is communicating. So if I meet you and you're you've just had a new baby, there's a certain amount of information you can take on board and then not much more. And then if I meet you and your child's now 3, and you've had a different experience, or perhaps, and I do meet families and they've not really had much interaction with speech language therapy. They've been told there's no need yet. And I think, okay, well, they could be doing the most amazing job. Who am I to say that they need, but it's about going, right, well, where are you now? What's the vocab now? What is going to make the most difference to you right now? Let's go there. Let's see where you're having success and let's build on that. And basically creating the environment again in your everyday life is giving those many opportunities for the brain to get practice and opportunities to just get better at the interaction and learning how to use my body to get my message across, essentially.
Yeah, makes so much sense. I was quite excited about this conversation. Yes, I was excited about speech and language. And so I put it out in one of the groups that I'm in, and I just asked if people had any questions that they wanted answered. Some of them, actually, I'm looking at, you've answered already.
Okay.
Like, what age should children or adults with Down syndrome start speech therapy? And so maybe you may want to answer that. You definitely answered the aims of speech therapy. There's a question here, which I found quite interesting. Is there an age where speech stops improving in people with Down syndrome?
Oh, that is tricky. Shall I just quickly touch on the age to start? Because I think I've already, as you said, I think I have already started that. But I guess if you are, well, I'm speaking as a clinician for children under 6. So, but I've worked with children who are a bit older than that, and it depends again on the moment where you can get the access. I would always say, in terms of starting early intervention speech language therapy, it's not I'm seeing speech and language and communication therapy, not necessarily speech therapy. I think it's really important to make that understanding, because we've talked about the fact that communication is lots of all of how your child's using your body and why. And that's where we need to start. And then the speech is one part of that we're looking at. And so doing speech, babbling, and knowing that the articulators are also the muscles and coordinating bits that you use for eating and drinking. So, when children learn to eat solids, typically we see a development and change in sounds that they're making. And that's because their body's getting practice at moving things in different ways and testing out how they can use their body. So, even though I'm going to be focusing on setting up the environment for a family to have good communication, good interaction, and just be tuning in to what your child's understanding, do they look at you when you go, oh, it's time for dinner? And they're like, or are they not interested in food? Is it something else? Is it the tickle game? If they're really little versus, if a child's been using some sign more, what are the signs that they use? Are they clear for you? Are they clear for other people? So it's about, what are the opportunities, not to make people feel that, as you say, they've missed the boat or not. And if it is more speech therapy, i.e. speech articulation therapy, then that is I would always say that we need to work on things that have function. So I'd be looking at doing sort of babbling and speech sound noises when your child's little, if they're not making words, to make funny noises, to be like what you were describing, you know, with singing, with nursery rhymes, with rhythm, with beatboxing, whatever works in your context, in your family, that you're practicing and increasing the opportunities to hear and make noises. As well as then perhaps if your child's moving to a place where you're looking at more specific speech sound needs, depending on what they might have going on for them as from speech production. Coming back to that other question, is there an age where speech stops improving? That is something that's probably sitting outside of my comfort zone in terms of answering without sort of research to back that up. But I would say if context is constantly changing. So I am someone who'll be like, if you're really motivated to practice, we know that dosage, i.e. practice, is something that can make a difference. For a really long time, for example, there's still language therapy, sort of grammatical therapies that we recommend into late adolescence for children with Down syndrome. So I think it's about, there are points often when you're in a therapy journey with a child where they might be less motivated to do sort of sit down and do speech and language therapy at a table with flashcards. So then it's about how do you build that in functionally in everyday life. So I'm not going to probably say, is there an age where it stops? I think it depends so much on the individual, the amount of intervention they've already had. If they haven't had very much, then I would always say you need to try something and see if the practice and dosage and making it as functional as it can be will have an impact for that person. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it makes
Feel free to come back with other questions.
I think this is the perfect time to say, like, to actually say how people can access some of these.
Yes. Yeah.
If they do have more questions, then if anyone does have questions, you can contact me as well, and I can forward them.
Absolutely, direct them to us.
Yeah.
But so I guess my purpose of being here is representing as a speech and language therapist from the Lejeune Clinic for children with Down syndrome, and there's a few of us who work with Lejeune who have different areas of interest and speciality, if you like. So some other colleagues who are more experienced with older children, and others who work more with literacy and reading and all of those sort of more specific areas as well. So as I said, the work I'm doing is typically in that early years, as in under preschool age or up to sort of early school age. Having said that, I'm also working with families where there's dual diagnosis of autism and Down syndrome. And I think that needs to be mentioned because that is something that can feel quite isolating for families because it doesn't sort of fit in terms of inclusion, it doesn't fit what is understood by society. It's a very sociable little person with Down syndrome, and you're finding that your child is not always able to be sociable, or that their sensory processing is quite different. They are neurodiverse in a different way to what is typically described for a child with Down syndrome. So it's just being able to know that there are other people with shared experiences, I guess, who are accessing our, and everyone is welcome. If you have questions, we welcome everybody who is sort of navigating this journey, and we will do what we can to support you or to signpost you to others who might be able to help as well. If that's okay.
Yes, thank you. Because and I've been saying it wrong for years, so it's Lejeune. I've been saying
Lejeune, named after Jérôme Lejeune, who was the doctor in France who discovered the T21, the third chromosome. So that's he, yeah.
Which, if I haven't explained it yet, is why podcast and the play is called
T21, exactly.
Alchemy. And so I've just been saying Homeboy's name wrong.
I think the thing that made him different is an interesting one, is that he was an advocate for supporting, once he identified this need, he was then advocating different interventions and therapies and approaches to be inclusive, which was quite unusual at the time. So
right. What tools and resources do you recommend?
Okay, so as I said, because of my clinical remit, it's in the early years. So I appreciate there's loads of stuff out there. And to be fair, I think this is part of the challenge for parents, is navigating the internet generally, and which bits to pay attention to, which bits not to pay attention to. I would say in terms of tools to start, I would always recommend Makaton, signing. And the reason I would recommend signing is because we know that children with Down syndrome are typically good visual learners compared to auditory learners. We've talked about hearing challenges that they might have. So signing is adding an additional layer of visual information as well as the auditory information. When you sign, you're giving more information to help make that message understood. So you're helping your child get the understanding, make sense of the word you're using. So it's like, and you are saying eat an egg. What are you going to have for breakfast? Egg or toast? So if you're doing that, when I sign while I'm talking, it also slows down how we speak. So it gives your child more time to do that coding and decoding, processing, understanding, and laying down those pathways. So getting visual information, hearing the words, putting them together, storing the meaning, and hopefully getting a motor skill. Signing, we know, is bigger muscles, bigger sort of motor development, which happens before the fine little muscles, which are the ones we use for speech and articulation as well. So motorically, they are easier. It's easier for bodies to get gesture and sign first, and it's used by humans anyway. Gesture comes before speech typically. We use gesture, so definitely using signing. It doesn't have to be Makaton. If your signing system is something else, then that's fine. But that's Makaton is what I use. And then visual aids and symbol. There's lots of different visual aids out there, but I guess what my point of this is twofold. One is that it's again, that visual information. So if you're looking at the question around sort of how do you help the environment by using other visual aids, we're helping add those layers of meaning to grow the vocabulary and give opportunity to store the right word and the right meaning. So using visual aids. And so obviously in terms of systems, there's the See and Learn, because they have pictures of, and they're inclusive. They have pictures of children with Down syndrome, and they have the words written as well, because some children are more able to hook into graphemes, i.e. letters, and have those words written, and that can really help with that transition to literacy. And more generally, I would encourage families to seek support around adult or parent-child interactions. So adult is ACI, adult-child interactions, or PCI, parent-child interactions, which is coming to the things we've mentioned, and that's the focus that I would use in our parent sessions that we do in Lejeune Clinic, which is really about helping the adult in this interaction. If you think of you and your son, when you have interactions, one of you has been on the planet longer, and you've had more time to develop your attention and listening skills. You've had more opportunity to practice and understand the world around you. So you need to model it. And it is exhausting. And I am always saying this with kindness and compassion for parents, because we've talked about this is adding in the layers of language learning that we don't always consider. And now you're having to do them more overtly. But you're setting up that interaction with parent-child interaction or adult-child interaction, where you then slow down how you speak. You're giving visual information, whether it's signing with visual cards, but in everyday life, we don't always use visual cards. You know, if you're just changing a nappy, you're just changing a nappy. So when you're doing that, making sure you're in, you've got eye contact, or you've got face-to-face gaze if your child's not as good with eye contact. But basically, every time we're making sure we're at the child's level, we're not being the big person in the room. We get down to where they are. They get more visual information from us easier. Then that gives them more opportunity to remember, store the way our face looks when we make those sounds, the way the word sounds, and to match the word with what's going on, to store that vocabulary. So accessing those parent-child interaction programs. So there's programs out there, the Hannon program, It Takes Two to Talk for example, there's a website, Hannon.org, where you can see lots of information as a parent and resources that you can download or buy. But if you're in your local services, to say this is the sort of approach that I would be recommending in the early years, particularly. And obviously then there's other programs that move into literacy that we'd be better off checking in with clinicians who are using those more, if that's okay.
No. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to include all of these things in the show notes.
Okay.
And so they'll be available for people who are tuning into the podcast. So, yeah.
And just one more thing to say then, there's a Speech and Language UK is a non-profit organisation that's about raising awareness of communication needs, and it has some really good training opportunities in there that anyone can access. So it's sort of, you can step through what is communication. And so for parents or professionals, our allies in the children's workforce, if you want to direct people to free resources, and they have also signposting in that website as well, so I can give you that link as well.
I've got a closing question, because I could probably, with another cup of tea, speak to you for another hour.
Indeed.
I've got a closing question. So firstly, thank you to those who submitted questions. Thank you very much. Really appreciate them. And also, for a parent who is scared that their child won't be understood without them, what would you want them to know?
Okay, because I think that's the real fear that most parents start this space. They're going, well, what am I going to do when they don't have me around to do that for them? Yeah. So I want to say that is a normal thing to be worried about, and to not panic, because there's lots of us who can help you on this journey. And what we're going to do is work out how we can help your child recognize what they can do for themselves. So how they use their body, their brilliant body, to do all the things that it can do to get a message across, to understand what is, to understand interaction, to understand that they need someone else to help them with that, to understand why they need to interact, to be able to ask for help, to be able to request things, to be able to say when things are going wrong, but also to just share their thoughts, their ideas, their motivations. So that's sort of helping your child understand. The way we teach that to your child is by modeling and through everyday life and routines. So by doing everyday life and routines with perhaps sort of parent-child interaction approaches or therapies, you are setting up them to be able to navigate how interaction works with other people. And then we have to sort of help transition it and fine-tune it when you're moving to a different, less skilled communicating partner, i.e. not mum or dad, and knowing that we might need to introduce other modes to support that. And that might be things like using visual aids. It might be using sign. Sign, I would always be an advocate of sign, because it is about using your body to get a message across and get support understanding. I think yes, that is your fear, absolutely, and I can appreciate and with kindness and compassion know that is completely a reasonable fear. So then what we're looking to do is then how can we all educate the environment? How can we educate your child's specific environment at home and wherever else they spend their days, and that it is absolutely within your right to expect that environment to be able to support your child. And you are an advocate, and it's exhausting, but there are some of us that are happy to help you on that journey, and to know that you're absolutely entitled to ask for help along the way. And there are generally, hopefully, wherever you are, you'll be able to find the right people that can offer you that help. And if they're not there, keep knocking and do seek out to people like yourself, Oneness, so that can help signpost you to others, perhaps, that can connect you and to give you some reassurance.
Thank you so much. And that's really reassuring, because yes, it is exhausting.
It's exhausting.
But you do feel supported. I felt supported by Lejeune and yourself, and so I do want people to know that there is support out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lovely conversation, a lovely chat.
Thanks so much for watching this episode. And if you got something out of it, then please do share with a friend or an ally or somebody who you think would get something out of this podcast.
T21 Alchemy. T21 Alchemy. It's a T21 Alchemy. T21 Alchemy. It's a T21 Alchemy.